as my husband introduced his mistress as my replacement at family dinner. What happened next? No one expected. Chapter 1. The Invitation. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, a crisp, white envelope adorned with my mother-in-law's elegant handwriting. Margaret Aldridge never used email for important family matters, considering digital communications lacking the personal touch. The card inside announced the annual Aldridge Family Dinner, a tradition spanning 4 decades that brought together the sprawling family tree of one of Boston's oldest families. I traced my finger over the embossed lettering, feeling the familiar weight of expectation that came with these gatherings. 15 years of marriage to James Aldridge had taught me the unspoken rules of his family. Appearance was everything, emotions were to be contained, and family legacy trumped personal happiness. "Eleanor?" James's voice echoed from the foyer of our Beacon Hill brownstone. "Are you home?" I slipped the invitation into the drawer of my writing desk and called back, "In the study." My husband appeared in the doorway, his 6-foot frame filling the space with the confident posture of a man accustomed to commanding rooms. At 45, James still maintained the athletic build of his college rowing days, his dark hair now threaded with distinguished silver at the temples. He loosened his tie, Hermes, a Christmas gift from me, and smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "Mother called," he said, crossing the room to pour himself a whiskey from the crystal decanter. "She's particularly excited about the dinner this year." I nodded, watching him. "The invitation just arrived." "Good, good." He swirled the amber liquid, not meeting my gaze. "There's something I've been meaning to discuss with you about the dinner." A knot formed in my stomach, the instinctive tightening I'd come to recognize as my body's warning system. Over the past 6 months, these moments had become more frequent. James working late, mysterious phone calls that ended when I entered the room, weekend business trips that left no paper trail. "What about it?" I kept my voice steady, a skill perfected through years of navigating Aldridge family politics. James drained his glass and set it down with deliberate care. "I think it's time for some changes, Eleanor, for both of us." The afternoon light caught the crystal tumbler, casting prism patterns across the antique Persian rug, a wedding gift from James's parents. I focused on those dancing lights as James spoke words that, despite my suspicions, still landed like physical blows. "I've met someone. Her name is Vanessa. She's young, vibrant. She understands the direction I want to take in life." He spoke as if discussing a business merger rather than the dissolution of our marriage. "I want to bring her to the family dinner. I think it's time everyone meets the woman who will be taking your place." The silence that followed seemed to have physical weight. I stared at him. This man I'd shared a bed with for 15 years, whose family history I could recite better than my own, whose coffee preferences I knew by heart. The stranger standing before me, proposing to parade his mistress in front of his entire family, in front of me. "You can't be serious." My voice sounded far away, as if belonging to someone else. "I'm entirely serious, Eleanor." His tone took on the edge he typically reserved for difficult clients at his law firm. "I've given this considerable thought. The dinner is the perfect opportunity. Everyone will be there. We can make the announcement once, and then proceed with the necessary arrangements." "Necessary arrangements," I repeated, the euphemism for divorce hanging between us. "Yes, I've already spoken with Philip about the legal aspects." Philip Bennett, James's college roommate and our family attorney. The betrayal deepened. How many people knew before me? "And what do you expect me to do? Sit there while you introduce this woman to your family? Pass her the gravy and offer congratulations?" James sighed, a sound of impatience rather than remorse. "I expected you to handle this with the grace you've always shown, Eleanor. It would be easier for everyone." Easier. The word tasted bitter. For whom exactly? For the family, for us, For Vanessa. He straightened his cuffs, another habit when he felt challenged. I'm not asking for your blessing, Eleanor. I'm informing you of my decision. In that moment, something shifted inside me. A tectonic movement in the landscape of my identity. For 15 years, I'd been Eleanor Aldridge, devoted wife, perfect hostess, gracious daughter-in-law. I'd sublimated my own ambitions as a writer to support James's career, postponed having children at his request, and navigated the treacherous waters of Boston high society without complaint. But as I looked at the stranger wearing my husband's face, I realized the role I'd perfected had just been eliminated, without so much as a courtesy notice. Get out, I said quietly. Eleanor, get out of my study. We'll discuss the logistics later. He hesitated, seemingly surprised by my calm tone. Then, with a curt nod, he left. I sat motionless until his footsteps faded, then pulled out my phone and dialed the one person who had known me before I became an Aldridge. Hey, stranger, answered Maya Russo, my best friend since freshman year at Wellesley. To what do I owe this midweek call? My husband just informed me he's bringing his mistress to the Aldridge family dinner to introduce her as my replacement. The sharp intake of breath was followed by a string of Italian expletives that would have made Maya's Sicilian grandmother blush. I'll be there in 30 minutes with emergency supplies, she said once she'd exhausted her vocabulary of curses. No need, I replied, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. I'm not falling apart. Eleanor! Actually, I interrupted, an idea taking shape. I think I'll attend this dinner after all. You can't be serious. Tell James to go to hell. Oh, I plan to. I glanced at my reflection in the antique mirror across the room, noting the steel in my eyes that hadn't been there minutes before. But not just yet. I believe I owe the Aldridge family one last appearance. After ending the call with a concerned Maya, I sat at my writing desk and pulled out a sheet of my personal stationery. For 15 years, I'd played by the Aldridge rules. Perhaps it was time to write some of my own. Chapter 2. The Other Woman. The week following James's announcement passed in a strange limbo. We moved around each other like cautious dancers, maintaining the facade of normalcy while sleeping in separate bedrooms. James spent most evenings out, returning late with the faint scent of unfamiliar perfume clinging to his clothes. I used the time to plan. First, I contacted my long-neglected literary agent, Diane, who was delighted to hear from me after what she called my extended hibernation. Next, I made an appointment with Carol Fisher, an attorney friend from my charity committee work who specialized in high-profile divorces. Then I began the meticulous work of documenting our finances, making copies of tax returns, investment, accounts, and property deeds. By Friday, I was ready for reconnaissance. You want me to what? Maya's voice carried through my phone speaker as I sorted through my closet. I need you to help me get information on Vanessa. James mentioned she works at the Gardner Museum in development. That's all I know. And how exactly am I supposed to extract this information? Break in and steal her personnel file? I smiled despite myself. Nothing so dramatic. You're on the museum's board. Surely you can find out something useful. Maya sighed, the sound of capitulation. Fine, but I still think you should skip this dinner and let James explain to his snooty family why his wife isn't there. Trust me, I replied, selecting a black dress I'd never worn, an impulse purchase that James had deemed too daring for an Aldridge wife. I need to be there for what I have planned. By Saturday afternoon, Maya had delivered as promised. Vanessa Calloway, 29, had joined the museum's development team 8 months ago after completing her master's in arts administration at NYU. She was reportedly brilliant at cultivating donors, with a special talent for charming the older, male patrons. She's also sickeningly gorgeous, Maya added during our coffee meeting at a discreet cafe far from Beacon Hill. Like a young Audrey Hepburn with better hair. Of course she is, I murmured, stirring my cappuccino. I managed to see a photo from a recent donor event. Want to see? I hesitated, then nodded. Maya slid her phone across the table. The woman in the photo was indeed beautiful, with delicate features, luminous skin, and dark hair styled in an elegant bob. She was laughing at something said by the elderly man beside her hand resting lightly on his arm in a gesture of practiced intimacy. That's Reginald Pierce, I noted, recognizing the museum's biggest donor. She's good. The best, Maya confirmed, reclaiming her phone. Word is, she's increased major gifts by 30% since joining. I absorbed this information, adding it to my mental file. Anything else? Maya leaned forward, lowering her voice. She's ambitious, Ellie. Very ambitious. There's talk she was hired specifically because of her connection to the Aldrich Foundation. The Aldrich Foundation was established by James's grandfather, a significant philanthropic force in Boston's cultural landscape and a major supporter of the Gardner Museum. You think she targeted James? The possibility hadn't occurred to me. Maya shrugged. Or he targeted her. Either way, it's convenient timing with him taking over as foundation chair next year. This new angle required consideration. If Vanessa had orchestrated this relationship for professional advancement, it added another dimension to my evolving plan. Thank you for this, I said, squeezing Maya's hand. What are you going to do? I smiled. I'm going to introduce myself to Ms. Calloway. After all, we'll be family dinner companions very soon. Monday morning found me at the Gardner Museum during its quietest hours. I'd dressed carefully in a conservative Chanel suit, the uniform of the wealthy donor class that Vanessa would be trained to recognize and respect. The information desk directed me to the development office, where I requested a meeting with Ms. Calloway regarding a potential gift in memory of my recently deceased aunt, entirely fictional. 20 minutes later, I was seated across from the woman who was sleeping with my husband. In person, Vanessa Calloway was even more striking than in her photograph. She wore a simple navy dress that conveyed professionalism while highlighting her slender figure. Her office was meticulously organized, adorned with a single orchid and strategically placed art history books. Mrs. Aldridge, she said, her composure slipping only momentarily when I provided my name. What a pleasure to meet you. I wasn't aware you had an appointment today. I appreciate you making time for me on short notice, I replied, studying her reaction. I've been meaning to become more involved with the museum. James speaks so highly of the work you're doing here. Oh, flush crept up her neck at the mention of my husband's name. Mr. Aldridge has been very supportive of our initiatives. I'm sure he has, I said, smiling pleasantly. He's always been generous with his support. Her eyes flickered with uncertainty, clearly trying to determine how much I knew. I maintained my cordial expression, enjoying her discomfort despite the anger simmering beneath my composed exterior. You mentioned a potential memorial gift? She prompted, attempting to steer the conversation to professional territory. Yes, though I'm now considering directing it to the symphony instead. I leaned forward slightly. I'm making several changes in my life recently. Reassessing priorities, you might say. Vanessa shifted in her chair, her discomfort now evident. Mrs. Aldridge. Eleanor, please. We should be on a first-name basis, don't you think? Given the circumstances. The color drained from her face. I'm not sure what you mean. Come now, Vanessa, I said, keeping my tone light. Let's not pretend. James has already informed me of his intention to bring you to the Aldridge family dinner this weekend as his replacement for me. Her eyes widened, genuine shock registering. He told you that? Interesting. She hadn't known about his blunt approach. Yes, quite directly. James has never been one for subtlety in business or personal matters. I maintained my calm demeanor. I thought we should meet privately first, woman to woman. Vanessa straightened, seemingly gathering her composure. I'm sorry you found out this way. It wasn't what either of us wanted. And what did you want, Vanessa? A discreet affair with a wealthy married man? Or something more strategic, given your professional ambitions and the Aldrich Foundation's influence in this city? Her expression hardened. My relationship with James has nothing to do with my work. Everything in Boston has to do with everything else, as you'll discover if you last in this world. I stood up, smoothing my skirt. One question before I... Go! Did he promise you children? The question caught her off guard. That's a very personal matter. It is, I agreed. But you see, James promised me children too, then spent 15 years finding reasons to postpone. First his career, then market instability, then his father's illness. There was always a perfect, reasonable excuse. Uncertainty flickered. Across her face, the first crack in her polished veneer. I'm not here to warn you off or create a scene, Vanessa. I simply wanted to see you for myself. I collected my purse. I look forward to seeing you at dinner on Saturday. I believe you'll find the Aldridge family illuminating. As I turned to leave, she called after me. Eleanor? I paused at the door. I never meant to hurt anyone. It just happened. I looked back at this young woman who believed she was different, special, the exception to rules that had constrained generations of Boston marriages. Nothing just happens in the Aldridge world, Vanessa. Everything is by design. I offered a final smile. The question is, whose design are you really part of? I left her looking troubled, which was precisely my intention. Seeds of doubt, carefully planted, would grow on their own. Back in my car, I allowed myself a moment to process the encounter. Meeting Vanessa had clarified something important. She wasn't a villain in this story any more than I was. We were both women navigating a system designed by and for men like James, men who viewed relationships as assets to be managed and upgraded when convenient. The difference was that after 15 years, I finally understood the game, and I was ready to change the rules. Chapter 3. Family Politics. The Aldridge family dinner was scheduled for Saturday at 7, but the true event began much earlier. By 4 o'clock, the stately mansion in Brookline would already be buzzing with activity, as Margaret Aldridge oversaw final preparations with military precision. For 15 years, I'd arrived early to assist my mother-in-law, a gesture that had never quite won her approval but had become expected. This year, I planned to break tradition in more ways than one. First, however, I needed intelligence from the inside. Eleanor, darling. Catherine Aldridge's voice carried a genuine warmth that had always set her apart from the rest of James's family. As the youngest of the 3 Aldridge siblings and the only daughter, Catherine had managed to escape the worst of the family's rigid expectations. We met for lunch at a quiet restaurant in Cambridge, far from the usual Aldridge haunts. At 38, Catherine retained the bohemian spirit that had scandalized her parents when she chose to study anthropology instead of law or business. Her academic career at MIT and marriage to Eliza, a brilliant computer scientist, had eventually been accepted by the family with grudging respect, though they were rarely invited to speak at the formal family gatherings. "You look different," she remarked after we ordered. "There's something sharper about you." I smiled. Betrayal has a clarifying effect. Catherine's expression darkened. "James told me what he's doing. It's unconscionable." "You know about Vanessa?" "Mother called me in a panic yesterday. Apparently, James finally informed her he's bringing a special guest to dinner." Catherine rolled her eyes. She's beside herself trying to figure out how to handle it without creating a scene. I felt a twisted satisfaction knowing Margaret was struggling with the social implications. And what does she think my role should be in this farce? That's why she called me. She hoped I could convince you to bow out gracefully. Catherine reached across the table to squeeze my hand. I told her that was absurd and insulting. But not surprising, I noted. No, not surprising. Catherine sighed. The Aldridge way. Preserve appearances at all costs. What else did she say? She's worried about how this will affect Father's health. You know he's been frailer since the stroke. William Aldridge Sr., James's father and the patriarch of the family, had suffered a minor stroke the previous year. His physical recovery had been remarkable for a man of 75, but the incident had accelerated James's ascension to leadership positions within both the family business and foundation. Is she more concerned about his health or his reaction to family scandal? I asked. Catherine offered a wry smile. Both, probably. Father may be physically weaker, but his standards haven't softened. Remember how he reacted when James's brother got divorced? I did remember. William Jr.'s divorce 5 years earlier had resulted in his effective demotion within the family business, regardless of the official explanation about pursuing other interests. Who else knows about Vanessa? Mother, father, and William definitely know. I'm not sure about the extended family. Catherine studied me. What are you planning, Eleanor? Why do you assume I'm planning something? Because I know that look. It's the same one you had when the hospital board tried to cut funding for the children's wing after you'd spent a year raising money for it. I smiled, remembering how I'd outmaneuvered the board chairman by rallying influential donors. I'm not planning anything dramatic. I'm simply going to attend the dinner. Catherine looked skeptical. With James bringing this woman? That's either masochistic or strategic, and you've never struck me as a masochist. Let's call it a farewell performance. I sipped my water. Now tell me who else will be attending. I need to know the full cast of characters. By the time our lunch concluded, I had a complete guest list and valuable insights into the family's reaction to James's scandalous plan. Catherine had also promised to text me when James arrived at the mansion, with or without Vanessa. Whatever you're planning, I'm on your side, she said as we parted. The Aldridge family may have welcomed you because of James, but you've earned your own place among us. More than this, Vanessa ever will. Her loyalty was touching, though I wondered if it would survive what I had in mind. Saturday arrived with picture-perfect autumn weather, crisp air, golden sunlight, and the particular quality of New England light that painters had tried to capture for centuries. I spent the morning at an appointment Maya had arranged with her personal stylist, emerging with a sophisticatedly updated version of myself. My honey blonde hair now fell in soft waves rather than the conservative bob I'd maintained for years, and subtle makeup enhanced my green eyes and high cheekbones. The transformation continued with the black dress James had disapproved of, now altered to fit perfectly. The neckline was modest enough for a family dinner but suggested confidence I'd rarely displayed in Aldridge gatherings. I completed the look with a single piece of jewelry, not from the Aldridge collection I'd been given access to over the years, but my grandmother's emerald pendant that had been deemed too ethnic for formal Aldridge events. At 6:45 p.m., my phone chimed with Catherine's text. Jay arrived 10 minutes ago with V, mother looking ill, father stone-faced, dinner at 7:30 now, don't rush. Perfect timing. I arrived at the Aldridge mansion at 7:25, just as the 20-some guests would be migrating from cocktails in the drawing room to dinner in the formal dining room. The butler who opened the door couldn't quite mask his surprise at seeing me. Good evening, Harrison, I said pleasantly. I believe they're waiting for me. Of course, Mrs. Aldridge, he recovered quickly. The family is just moving to the dining room. I handed him my coat and made my entrance. The grand hallway opened to the dining room where the assembled Aldridge clan was indeed taking their seats. Conversations faltered as heads turned toward me. I spotted James at the far end of the table, his face draining of color as he registered my presence. Beside him, looking uncomfortable in an expensive but conservative blue dress, sat Vanessa. Margaret Aldridge, poised at her end of the table, recovered first. Eleanor, how unexpected. We weren't sure you would join us. Her tone carried the subtle reproach I'd grown accustomed to over 15 years of marriage to her son. Tonight, it glanced off me without effect. I wouldn't miss the annual family dinner, Margaret, I replied, moving toward the empty seat beside Catherine. Traditions are important, aren't they? William Aldridge Sr. nodded approvingly from his place at the head of the table. Well said. Eleanor, tradition is the bedrock of this family. His pointed glance toward James carried unmistakable disapproval. James, I noted with satisfaction, looked increasingly uncomfortable. We were just about to begin, Margaret said, gesturing to the staff to serve the first course. James was about to introduce his guest. All eyes turned expectantly to James, who cleared his throat and reached for his water glass. Yes, well, as you can see, we have a special guest joining us tonight. His voice sounded strained. This is Vanessa Calloway. She's a close friend who has become very important to me. A heavy silence fell over the table. I observed the reactions. William Sr.'s hardening expression, William Jr.'s poorly concealed smirk at his brother's discomfort, Catherine's supportive hand on my arm, the mixture of shock, curiosity, and schadenfreude on the faces of aunts, uncles, and cousins. Vanessa, I spoke into the silence, causing heads to swivel toward me. How lovely to see you again. That color is much more suitable for an Aldridge dinner than what you wore to the museum benefit last month. Vanessa's eyes widened at my friendly tone, clearly having expected hostility. Thank you, Eleanor. It's good to see you too. You two have met? Margaret asked sharply. Oh, yes. I smiled pleasantly. I made a point of introducing myself earlier this week. After all, it's not every day your husband brings home his replacement. Gasps rippled around the table. James's face flushed with anger. Eleanor, this isn't the place. On the contrary, I interrupted. You specifically told me this dinner would be the perfect opportunity to announce the changes in our marriage. That's why you invited Vanessa, isn't it? So everyone could meet her at once? I turned to the stunned family members. James thought it would be more efficient this way. One announcement, and then we could proceed with the necessary arrangements, as he put it. William Sr. slammed his hand on the table, causing the crystal to jump. James Alexander Aldridge, what is the meaning of this? James straightened, attempting to regain control of the situation. Father, I was planning to explain more delicately, but yes, Vanessa and I have developed a relationship, and I've decided to end my marriage to Eleanor. You've decided? William's voice was dangerously quiet. And you thought it appropriate to bring this woman to our family dinner before your divorce is even finalized? It's a new world, Father, James replied with forced confidence. I thought it best to be transparent rather than hide behind outdated social conventions. William Sr. turned to Vanessa, who seemed to be shrinking in her chair. Young woman, are you aware of what you've stepped into? Before she could respond, I raised my wine glass. A toast, I announced, drawing all attention, back to me. To transparency and new beginnings. After all, isn't that what James is advocating? Reflexively, people reached for their glasses, trained by years of social conditioning to respond to a toast. To James and his vision for the future, I continued, my voice steady. A future where, I assume, he'll bring the same principles of transparency to his leadership of the Aldridge Foundation. William Sr.'s eyes narrowed. What are you suggesting, Eleanor? Nothing at all, I replied innocently. Though in the spirit of transparency, the family should know that James has been quietly restructuring the foundation's investment portfolio without board approval. Quite innovative, really, moving funds through a series of shell companies before reinvesting in companies connected to Rockwell Partners. The color drained from James's face. Rockwell Partners was the private equity firm run by his golf partner and friend, Martin Rockwell, known for aggressive and occasionally questionable investment strategies. "That's a private foundation matter," James said tightly. "Is it? I thought we were being transparent tonight." I sipped my wine. "Just as I'm sure James has been transparent with Vanessa about his financial arrangements." Vanessa glanced at James with uncertainty. "What is she talking about?" "Nothing that concerns you," he snapped. "Actually," I continued pleasantly, "it might concern her greatly, especially if she's planning a future with you, James. The prenuptial agreement you signed specified that infidelity would substantially alter the terms of our divorce settlement." I turned to Vanessa. "Did he mention that? Or that the Aldridge family trust has very specific morality clauses that could affect his access to capital?" Margaret gasped. "Eleanor, these matters are not for dinner conversation." "No?" I raised an eyebrow. But James felt this dinner was the appropriate venue to announce he was replacing me. I'm simply providing context for his decision. William Sr. was watching me with an unreadable expression. "You seem remarkably well informed about family financial matters, Eleanor." 15 years is a long time to observe, William, especially when one isn't taken seriously as anything more than an appropriate wife. I met his gaze directly. "I've always had an excellent memory and a talent for connecting dots." The first course sat untouched as the tension at the table thickened. James looked increasingly agitated, while Vanessa appeared bewildered by the unexpected direction of the evening. "Perhaps," William Sr. said slowly, "we should postpone this dinner and address these matters privately." "That won't be necessary on my account," I replied, placing my napkin beside my plate and standing. "I've said what I came to say. I'll leave you all to enjoy your meal and discuss the future of the Aldridge family." I turned to Vanessa. "A word of advice, my dear. Make sure you understand exactly what you're inheriting before you sign anything." As I walked toward the door, Catherine rose to follow me. I stopped her with a gentle hand. "Stay, Kath. Your family needs you tonight." James stood abruptly. "Eleanor, wait. We need to talk." "We've had 15 years to talk, James. You said everything you needed to say when you brought your mistress to your family's home and asked me to step aside, gracefully." I smiled at the assembled family. "Thank you all for 15 interesting years. I wish you well with the changes ahead." And with that, I walked out of the Aldridge mansion, leaving behind a stunned silence and the first course of what promised to be the most memorable family dinner in Aldridge history. In the cool autumn night, I took my first deep breath as a woman who had finally freed herself from golden handcuffs I hadn't even recognized until they were unlocked. Whatever came next would be on my terms, not the Aldridge family's. Little did I know that what would happen next, no one, not even I, could have expected. OSA Chapter 4, Unexpected Allies. The call came at 7:15 the next morning as I sat on my terrace with coffee, watching the sun illuminate the changing leaves in the public garden. The number was unfamiliar. "Eleanor Aldridge," I answered. "Eleanor? It's William." My father-in-law's gravelly voice was unmistakable. "I'd like to see you. Privately." Of all the reactions I'd anticipated to my dinner exit, a direct approach from William Sr. wasn't among them. In 15 years, we'd never had a one-on-one conversation beyond brief pleasantries. "May I ask why?" "I think you know why," he replied, characteristically direct. "My office? 11 o'clock. Harrison will escort you directly to me." It wasn't a request. "I'll be there." After hanging up, I called Maya, who answered groggily. "Do you know what time it is on a Sunday?" "William Aldridge Sr. just summoned me to a private meeting at his office." That woke her up. "What? Why?" "I don't know exactly, but it's about last night. What happened after you left? I've been dying for details." I smiled, picturing the chaos I'd left behind. I'm not entirely sure, but I made certain nobody enjoyed their dinner. You magnificent bitch, Maya said with affection. Are you going to meet with William? Yes, but I need advice on strategy. While I'd interacted with my father-in-law at countless family functions, I'd never engaged with him on business matters. William Aldridge Sr. had built his father's modest law practice into one of Boston's most powerful firms before diversifying into real estate and investment management. His reputation for strategic brilliance was matched only by his unyielding standards. Wear your Navy Armani suit, Maya advised. Power outfit. And don't forget, you're the wronged party here. By 10:55, I was being led through the hushed corridors of Aldridge Enterprises headquarters in the financial district. The Sunday quiet made the gleaming marble and dark wood even more imposing. Harrison, who had served the Aldridge family for over 30 years, maintained a respectful silence as he escorted me to the private elevator that accessed only the top floor. William's office occupied the northeast corner, offering commanding views of Boston Harbor. The space reflected its occupant: substantial mahogany furniture, minimal decorations save for a few maritime paintings, and an ancient Persian rug that family legend claimed had once belonged to a Shah. William rose from behind his desk when I entered, a courtesy I hadn't expected. At 75, he remained an imposing figure, tall and straight-backed despite the slight drag in his left leg from the stroke. Eleanor, thank you for coming. He gestured to the sitting area by the windows rather than the chairs facing his desk. Another unexpected courtesy. Your call was intriguing, I said, taking a seat in one of the leather armchairs. I admit I'm curious about why you wanted to see me. William settled across from me, studying me with the penetrating gaze that had intimidated generations of lawyers and business rivals. I've underestimated you, he said finally. It seems we all have. I kept my expression neutral. Perhaps you simply never looked closely enough. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Fair point. You've always been appropriate. Until last night. Circumstances changed. I adapted. Indeed. He nodded slowly. Tell me about James and the foundation investments. So this was it. He wanted to verify my claims about his son's financial manipulations. I had gambled that the information would catch William's attention more than the marital drama. I noticed discrepancies in the foundation reports 6 months ago, I explained. At first, I thought it was just an accounting error. But then I saw a pattern of funds moving through a series of smaller transfers, eventually being reinvested through entities connected to Martin Rockwell's firm. And how did you access this information? James wouldn't have shared it willingly. I've been the foundation's event planner for a decade, William. I'm copied on most communications for logistical purposes. No one thinks twice about sending. The quiet wife documents. And James has always used the same password for everything, his boarding school dormitory number followed by his mother's birthday. William's expression darkened. Careless? Very, I agreed, especially when combined with leaving financial statements open on his desk when he takes calls, or discussing sensitive matters on speakerphone while assuming I'm focused on planning charity galas. What else do you know about my son's activities? I considered my next words carefully. This conversation was delicate. I wanted to leverage my knowledge without seeming vindictive. I know the Rockwell investments aren't performing as promised. I know James committed more foundation money than was authorized. And I suspect, though I can't prove, that there's a personal benefit to him beyond friendship with Martin. William was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he surprised me again. Would you like some coffee? Or perhaps something stronger? I raised an eyebrow. Coffee would be fine. He pressed a button on the table between us, and moments later, Harrison appeared with a silver coffee service that suggested this Sunday meeting wasn't as impromptu as it had seemed. Once we were served and alone again, William leaned back in his chair. You've put me in an interesting position, Eleanor. My son has embarrassed the family with both his personal indiscretion and, it seems, his professional judgment. I didn't come to dinner last night to create problems for the Aldridge family, I replied carefully. I came because James insisted on humiliating me publicly. I simply refused to be the only one uncomfortable at that table. William nodded, a gleam of something like approval in his eyes. You showed spine. It's a quality I've always respected, though rarely seen in my daughters-in-law. He sipped his coffee. What do you want, Eleanor? The directness of the question surprised me. Excuse me? You're an intelligent woman who's clearly been paying attention for 15 years. You must have a goal in mind. What is it? I considered, deflecting, but decided that matching his directness would serve me better. I want what I've earned. Half of all marital assets, appropriate compensation for the years I've dedicated to the Aldridge Foundation without salary, and a clean break, with no attempts to damage my reputation as I rebuild my life. Reasonable requests, he acknowledged. And if I were to offer something more? I studied him carefully. What do you have in mind? William set down his cup with deliberation. The foundation is in crisis, whether the board knows it yet or not. James has mismanaged funds and potentially violated several regulations. This could damage not just the family name but the charitable work the foundation has supported for generations. That would be unfortunate, I agreed, beginning to see where this conversation was heading. The foundation needs someone who understands its operations intimately but hasn't been involved in James's creative financing. William fixed me with that penetrating gaze. Someone like you. I couldn't hide my surprise. You want me to remain involved with the foundation after James and I divorce? Not just involved. I want you to take over as executive director. The proposal was so unexpected that for a moment I couldn't respond. The executive director position had been held by James for the past 3 years, and before that by his uncle. No woman, and certainly no non-blood Aldridge, had ever led the foundation. William, while I appreciate the offer, James would never allow it. James is not in a position to allow or disallow anything at the moment. William's tone hardened. Last night after you left, I had a private conversation with my son. When presented with evidence of his financial mismanagement, he tried to blame you. I couldn't help but laugh. Me? I've never had signing authority on any Aldridge account. Precisely why the accusation failed spectacularly. William almost smiled. This morning, I convened an emergency call with key board members. James has been temporarily suspended from his duties pending a full audit. The implications were staggering. William Aldridge Sr. had effectively sided with me over his own son. Why me? I asked, genuinely curious. There must be dozens of qualified financial experts you could bring in. None with your combination of institutional knowledge, social connections, and proven loyalty to the Foundation's mission. William leaned forward slightly. And none who provide such a perfectly satisfying consequence for my son's appalling behavior. There it was. The true motivation. William wasn't just offering me a position. He was exacting a specific form of punishment on James. Having his discarded wife elevated to his former position would be far more painful to my husband's pride than any financial penalty. What about Vanessa? I asked. I assume she's still in the picture? William's expression darkened. That situation is evolving. Your revelations about financial matters raised questions about her involvement. She works for an institution that receives substantial funding from our foundation. I never suggested she was involved in anything improper, I said carefully. No, but the appearance of conflict is concerning. William waved a hand dismissively. In any case, I doubt the association will continue much longer. James's financial future has become considerably less certain overnight. I took a moment. to absorb this information, recognizing that William's offer was both an opportunity and a test. If, and this is hypothetical, I were to consider such a position, I would need complete autonomy to run the foundation according to proper governance standards. No interference from family politics, William nodded approvingly. That would be the point, wouldn't it? To restore proper governance. And my divorce from James would proceed with your support, not hindrance. I'll ensure it's handled fairly and expeditiously. William's expression became almost respectful. You've earned your freedom, Eleanor, but I'd rather not lose your capabilities from the family enterprise. I'll need time to consider, I said, not wanting to appear too eager, despite the rush of vindication I felt. Of course, the board meets on Tuesday to formalize James's suspension and appoint an interim director. William stood, signaling our meeting was concluding. I'll need your answer by tomorrow evening. As Harrison escorted me back through the quiet halls of Aldridge Enterprises, my mind raced with the implications of this surprising turn of events. William's offer represented everything I'd secretly desired but never believed possible. Recognition, authority, and the chance to step out of James's shadow while remaining connected to the philanthropic work I genuinely valued. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that accepting would entangle me with the Aldridge family in new and potentially complicated ways, even as I divorced one of its members. Outside, the crisp October air cleared my head. I pulled out my phone and texted Maya. Meeting over. Drinks needed. Major plot twist. Her reply came instantly. My place. 1 hour. Bring details or don't bother coming. I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in months. Whatever I decided about, William's offer, the balance of power had shifted dramatically. For the first time in 15 years, I was negotiating from a position of strength rather than polite accommodation. As I walked toward the tea station rather than calling my usual car service, another small act of independence, I couldn't help but wonder what James was doing at that moment. Was he facing the collapse of both his marriage and his career? Was Vanessa reconsidering her role as my replacement, now that James's golden future appeared tarnished? And most importantly, what did I truly want for my next chapter? For revelations. He offered you what? Maya nearly choked on her mimosa. We were settled in her Cambridge apartment, a converted loft space that reflected her artistic sensibilities with its exposed brick, eclectic furnishings, and walls covered in her photography. The Sunday brunch spread between us, bagels, lox, and fruit from her favorite deli, remained largely untouched as I recounted my meeting with William, executive director of the Aldridge Foundation. I still couldn't quite believe it myself. Effective immediately if I accept. Maya shook her head in amazement. That's diabolical. William is punishing James by replacing him with you, just as James tried to replace you with Vanessa. The symmetry is almost poetic. I hadn't thought of it that way, but you're right. I smiled wryly. The question is whether I want to be the instrument of William's revenge, elegant as it may be. Forget revenge. Think opportunity. Maya leaned forward intently. You've basically run that foundation for years while James took the credit. This is your chance to do it openly, with full authority and recognition. She wasn't wrong. Over the years, I'd conceived and executed most of the foundation's major initiatives, while James presented them to the board and collected the accolades. The thought of finally receiving proper credit for my work was undeniably appealing. But it keeps me connected to the Aldridge family even as I'm divorcing James, I pointed out. Is that really a clean break? Maya considered this. Maybe a clean break isn't what you need. Maybe what you need is to redefine the relationship on your terms. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with a text from Catherine. Jay moved out last night. Took some clothes, headed to the Ritz. Word is V didn't join him. Call me. I showed the message to Maya, who raised her eyebrows. The plot thickens. Should we place bets on how quickly Vanessa disappears from this story? That's not fair to her, I said, surprising myself with the defense. She's as much a pawn in this as I was, just newer to the game. Eleanor Aldridge, defender of the Mistress. Now I've seen everything. Maya refilled our glasses. So what are you going to do about William's offer? I gazed out her window at the Charles River flowing serenely below. I think I need more information before I decide. That information came in an unexpected form later that afternoon when my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Vanessa Calloway standing on my doorstep, looking considerably less polished than she had at dinner. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore jeans and a sweater rather than her usual carefully curated outfits. "I'm sorry to show up unannounced," she said, her voice unsteady. "I didn't know where else to go." Curiosity overcame my initial impulse to shut the door in her face. "Come in." I led her to the living room, noting how she glanced around at the home I'd shared with James, taking in the subtle evidence of my taste that had shaped our living space despite James's controlling nature. "Would you like some tea?" I offered. Falling back on ingrained social graces, she nodded gratefully. "Please." When I returned with 2 cups, Vanessa had composed herself somewhat, sitting rigidly on the edge of the sofa. "I'm sure this is the last thing you expected today," she began. "Not quite," I replied, settling into the armchair across from her. "But certainly high on the list of surprises. What brings you here, Vanessa?" She took a deep breath. "I need to know what's happening. James won't tell me anything except that there's been a temporary misunderstanding with his family. He's been on the phone nonstop, drinking too much, and—" She hesitated. "He's not the man I thought he was." "No," I agreed quietly. "He rarely is." Her eyes flashed with a hint of defiance. "I'm not a homewrecker, Eleanor. James told me. Your marriage was effectively over, that you had an understanding." I couldn't help but laugh. The only understanding in our marriage was that I would support his ambitions while subordinating my own, an arrangement I foolishly accepted for 15 years. Vanessa looked down at her untouched tea. "He said you were cold, uninterested in having children, focused only on your charity work." The familiar accusations stung despite my emotional armor. And yet, which of us showed up at his family's home when he paraded his mistress in front of them? Which of us spent 15 years planning perfect events for his foundation while he took credit for my work? I leaned forward. "Did he tell you? I wanted children from the beginning, while he invented one excuse after another to postpone." Uncertainty crossed her face. "He said you both agreed to wait until his career was established." His career was established 10 years ago, Vanessa. The truth is, James doesn't want children disrupting his carefully controlled life. But he knows that's not an acceptable position for an Aldridge heir. So he created a convenient narrative that made me the obstacle. She absorbed this, her expression troubled. "Last night, after you left, it was awful. His father took him into the study. When they came out, Mr. Aldridge announced dinner was over and everyone should leave. James was— I've never seen him like that. White-faced, almost shaking. William confronted him about financial irregularities at the foundation," I explained. "Deciding transparency might be the kindest approach. James has been making unauthorized investments with foundation money. There will be consequences." Vanessa's face paled. "What kind of consequences?" "He's being suspended from his position pending an audit. His financial situation is likely to become complicated." "That's why he's been making all those calls," she murmured, more to herself than to me. "But what does this have to do with the museum?" He kept mentioning potential problems for the museum's funding. I studied her carefully. "The Aldridge Foundation is one of the Gardner Museum's largest donors. Given your relationship with James and his current legal issues, there could be questions about conflicts of interest." But I had nothing to do with any financial decisions. Her voice rose in panic. I've only worked in development for 8 months. I don't have any authority over investments or grants. Did you know about the foundation's donation when you became involved with James? She hesitated, then nodded miserably. Of course I knew. Everyone in development knows our major donors, but that's not why. She trailed off, looking lost. Despite everything, I felt a flicker of sympathy. Why did you come here today, Vanessa? I don't know what to do, she admitted, her composure finally cracking. Everything's falling apart. James is talking about moving to New York temporarily, says we need to weather the storm. My boss called this morning asking awkward questions about my relationship with the Aldridge family. I feel like I've walked into a minefield blindfolded. I considered her for a long moment. This woman had knowingly become involved with my husband, allowed herself to be presented as my replacement, and participated in my public humiliation. By rights, I should despise her. Yet looking at her now, young, frightened, and clearly over her head, I recognized something of my younger self. Hadn't I also been dazzled by the Aldridge name and all it represented? Hadn't I also believed James's carefully constructed narratives? The Aldridge family protects itself above all else, I said finally. If your relationship with James threatens their reputation or financial interests, they'll ensure it ends, one way or another. What should I do? Her question was barely audible. It was a surreal moment, my husband's mistress asking for my advice. But then, who better understood navigating the treacherous waters of Aldridge family politics? If I were you, I'd distance myself immediately. Return to your career, make it clear to your supervisors that the relationship is over, and emphasize your professional integrity. The scandal will fade if you don't become entangled in the financial investigation. And James? She asked, her voice small. James will survive. Aldridge men always do. I set down my teacup. The real question is whether you want to be collateral damage in a family war you can't possibly win. Vanessa nodded slowly, absorbing my words. You're being kinder than I deserve. This isn't kindness. It's recognition of a shared experience. I stood, signaling our conversation was ending. We were both drawn to the same mirage, Vanessa. The difference is I spent 15 years trying to drink from it before realizing it wasn't real. As I showed her to the door, Vanessa paused. He said something strange last night when he was drunk. He kept mumbling about the other funds and how his father would destroy everything if he found out about Bermuda. She looked at me questioningly. Does that mean anything to you? It didn't. But the mention of Bermuda triggered a memory, a conversation I'd overheard between James and Martin Rockwell at last year's Christmas party, something about offshore protection and regulatory hurdles. It might, I said carefully. Thank you for telling me. After Vanessa left, I sat in my study considering this new information. If James had moved foundation money offshore to Bermuda, the situation was potentially more serious than even William realized. Such actions might cross the line from mismanagement to outright fraud. I picked up my phone and called the one person who might help me understand the implications. Richard, it's Eleanor Aldridge. I need your expertise on something sensitive. Can we meet? Richard Chen had been my friend since college, an early ally at Wellesley where he'd taught financial law before moving to Harvard Business School. As one of the few people in my life with no connection to the Aldridge family, his advice would be both expert and unbiased. For you, always, he replied. What's this about? Potentially serious financial improprieties involving a charitable foundation, I said carefully, and possibly offshore accounts in Bermuda. There was a pause. I see. Hypothetically speaking, of course. Of course. I'm free this evening. My office at 7? I'll be there. After hanging up, I texted Catherine, asking for any information she might have about James's recent travel to Bermuda or connections there. Then I called Maya to fill her in on Vanessa's unexpected visit. "So the mistress came crying to you?" Maya said incredulously. "That's either the most pathetic thing I've ever heard or the most calculating." "I think she's genuinely scared," I replied. "And she may have inadvertently given me important information about James's financial dealings." "How the tables have turned," Maya mused. 24 hours ago, you were the discarded wife. Now you're fielding William's job offers and receiving intelligence from your husband's fleeing mistress." Put that way, it did seem rather remarkable how quickly the dynamic had shifted. I need to understand exactly what James has done before I make any decisions about William's offer. "Smart move," Maya agreed. "But Eleanor, be careful. The Aldridges close ranks when threatened. Even if William seems to be on your side now, that could change if you dig too deep." It was good advice. For all his apparent support, William Aldridge Sr. was still protecting family interests above all. If James's misdeeds were worse than expected, William's alliance with me might prove temporary. By the time I arrived at Richard's office that evening, I had received a reply from Catherine. "Jay went to Bermuda 3X last year. Said it was for foundation donor meetings but was secretive about details. Dad suspicious but couldn't prove anything wrong." Richard welcomed me with a warm hug, one of the few people who treated me as Eleanor rather than Mrs. Aldridge. His cluttered office reflected his brilliant, eclectic mind, with books stacked on every surface and notes scribbled on multiple whiteboards. "So," he said once we were settled, "are we talking about the Aldridge Foundation?" I nodded, unsurprised he'd connected the dots. "What I tell you stays between us?" "Attorney-client privilege," he confirmed. "Consider this a consultation." Over the next hour, I laid out everything I knew. James's unauthorized investments through Rockwell Partners, his multiple trips to Bermuda, the overheard conversation about offshore protection, and Vanessa's mention of the other funds. Richard listened intently, occasionally making notes. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair with a serious expression. "What you're describing could be several things, Eleanor. Best case scenario, James has been using Bermuda accounts for aggressive but legal tax avoidance. Worst case, he's been moving charitable foundation money into private offshore accounts for personal benefit." "Which would be embezzlement," Richard said bluntly. "A federal crime with serious consequences, not to mention violations of charitable foundation regulations that could threaten the foundation's tax-exempt status." I absorbed this soberly. "How could I find out which scenario we're dealing with?" Richard hesitated. "Legally, you'd need authorized access to the foundation's complete financial records, including international wire transfers. Without that, it's just speculation." A plan began forming in my mind. What if I were to become the foundation's executive director? Richard's eyebrows shot up. "That would certainly give you access. But Eleanor, if you find evidence of criminal activity, you'd be legally obligated to report it. Are you prepared to potentially send your husband to prison?" The question hung in the air. Despite everything James had done, the thought of being responsible for his criminal prosecution was troubling. "I need to know the truth," I said finally. "Whatever it is." Richard nodded solemnly. "Then accept the position if it's offered. But be careful. If James has been embezzling and realizes you're investigating, he could be dangerous." "James isn't violent," I objected. "People do desperate things when millions of dollars and prison time are at stake," Richard warned. "Don't underestimate what he might do to protect himself." As I left Richard's office, his warning echoed in my mind. Had I misjudged James's capacity for harm? The man who'd coldly introduced his mistress as my replacement had already proven capable of cruelty I wouldn't have predicted a year ago. Back home, I found a message from William requesting My decision about the executive director position. After everything I'd learned, the choice was clear. Not just for vindication or career advancement, but because the Foundation's mission might be in genuine jeopardy. I texted back a simple response. I accept. William's reply came moments later. Excellent. Board meeting Tuesday at 10 a.m. Be prepared. As I prepared for bed that night, I realized I hadn't spent a single moment grieving my marriage. Instead, I felt a growing sense of purpose and determination. If James had indeed crossed the line from unethical to illegal behavior, I would be the one to uncover it. Not out of vengeance, but because it was the right thing to do. Little did I know that accepting William's offer would set in motion events far more consequential and dangerous than I could have imagined. Chapter 6. The New Director. The Aldrich Foundation offices occupied the entire 10th floor of a historic building in Boston's financial district. For 15 years, I'd visited these offices regularly, but always as James's wife, organizing events, attending board functions, smiling pleasantly while important men made decisions. Today, I entered as the newly appointed executive director. The emergency board meeting that morning had proceeded exactly as William had orchestrated. With clinical precision, he had presented evidence of James's unauthorized investments, the underperformance of these investments, and the potential regulatory issues they raised. The board, composed largely of Aldrich family members and longtime allies, had voted unanimously to suspend James and appoint me as interim executive director, with William making the case for my deep institutional knowledge and unquestionable dedication to the Foundation's mission. James had not been present. Now, as Harrison escorted me to what had been my husband's office, I noted the stunned expressions of the staff. News traveled fast, but clearly not everyone had been briefed on the dramatic change in leadership. Mrs. Aldridge, James's executive assistant Diane, stood as I approached. Her face betrayed confusion as she glanced between me and Harrison. "We weren't expecting you today." "Ms. Reynolds will be occupying the director's office from now on," Harrison explained with practiced neutrality. "By order of the board." Diane's eyes widened. I see. Should I arrange for IT to update the system's access?" "That would be helpful," I replied, keeping my tone businesslike. "And please gather the senior staff for a meeting at 11. As Harrison opened the office door for me, I caught Diane reaching for her phone, no doubt to spread the news or possibly alert James. It didn't matter. Everything was now official. James's, now my, office reflected his personality perfectly. Impressive, but impersonal. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of Boston Harbor, while the furnishings conveyed power without personality, expensive leather and mahogany selected to impress rather than comfort. The walls displayed framed news articles about the Foundation and photographs of James with various dignitaries, but nothing personal, not even a picture of me. Harrison cleared his throat. "Mr. Aldridge Sr. asked me to inform you that Ms. Parker from IT and Mr. Donovan from Finance will arrive shortly to provide all necessary access codes and files." I nodded my thanks. "Harrison, how long have you worked for the Aldridge family?" He straightened imperceptibly. 32 years, ma'am. In that time, you've undoubtedly seen many family situations." His expression remained perfectly neutral. "Indeed, ma'am. Where do your loyalties lie in this particular situation?" If he was surprised by my directness, he didn't show it. "My duty is to the family as a whole, ma'am. I serve whoever leads the family interests." It was the diplomatic answer I'd expected. "And who leads those interests now, in your assessment?" For the first time, I saw a flicker of something, respect perhaps, in his eyes. "Mr. Aldridge Sr. remains the patriarch, but he has made his confidence in you quite clear. My service extends to you in your new capacity." I smiled slightly. "Thank you for your candor, Harrison. That will be all for now." After he departed, I took a moment to absorb the reality of my new position. Then I began a methodical examination of James's office. The computer was password protected, but I already knew his standard password pattern. The filing cabinets were locked, but I found the keys in the desk drawer exactly where James always kept them. My husband was nothing if not consistent in his habits. By the time the IT director arrived to formally grant me system access, I had already reviewed the most recent board meeting minutes, foundation tax filings, and grant distribution reports. None contained obvious evidence of the Bermuda accounts, but I hadn't expected James to document potentially illegal activities in official records. The morning passed in a whirlwind of meetings and introductions. I presented myself to the senior staff with calm authority, acknowledging the unusual circumstances without dwelling on them. Most seemed cautiously accepting of my leadership, likely taking their cue from William's clear endorsement. By early afternoon, I had established my presence and begun the delicate process of probing for information about the Foundation's international banking relationships. I started with the Chief Financial Officer, Martin Brooks, a longtime Aldridge employee who managed the Foundation's legitimate financial operations. "Martin, I'm reviewing our banking relationships as part of a general assessment," I explained, when he arrived for our scheduled meeting. "Do we maintain any international accounts?" He appeared mildly surprised by the question. "We have correspondent banking relationships for our international grants, primarily in the UK and European Union, all properly registered and documented in our filings." "What about the Caribbean? Bermuda, perhaps?" His expression shifted subtly. "Not that I'm aware of, Ms. Reynolds. Any banking relationship would need to pass through my department and receive board approval." "Unless it didn't," I suggested carefully. Martin looked distinctly uncomfortable. "I'm not sure I understand." "I think you do." I held his gaze steadily. "The board has suspended James pending a full investigation of unauthorized financial activities. I need to know the full extent of those activities, including any offshore accounts that might have been established without proper authorization." He paled visibly. "I would not have been involved in such arrangements if they exist, but you suspected they might," I pressed. After a long pause, he nodded. "There were anomalies. Transfers to Rockwell Partners that didn't fully track. James assured me they were properly documented at the board level." "Did you believe him?" Martin looked away. "I wanted to. Questioning an Aldridge in this organization has never been advisable." I understood his position all too well. "Times are changing, Martin. I need your help to uncover the truth, whatever it is. The Foundation's mission and reputation depend on it." By the end of our conversation, Martin had agreed to conduct a discreet but thorough review of all financial transactions over the past 3 years, paying special attention to any connections to Bermuda or other offshore locations. As the afternoon waned, I was reviewing grant proposals when my phone buzzed with a text from Maya. "Jay just arrived at BH. Looks furious. Heads up. BH, Beacon Hill, our home." I had been expecting this confrontation, though I'd hoped for more. Time to secure my position at the Foundation. I called security. "This is Eleanor Reynolds in the director's office. If James Aldridge attempts to enter the building, please notify me immediately, but do not allow him access to this floor." 10 minutes later, my office phone rang. "Mr. James Aldridge is in the lobby, Ms. Reynolds," the security guard informed me. "He's demanding to be allowed upstairs. Says he needs to retrieve personal items from his office." "Thank you for alerting me. Please inform Mr. Aldridge that any personal items will be collected and delivered to him. He is not authorized to access the Foundation offices at this time." After hanging up, I sent a quick text to William, informing him of the situation. His response was immediate. "Security has clear instructions. Stay where you are." I had just returned to my work when my cell phone rang, James's number. "Hello, James," I answered calmly. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" His voice vibrated with rage. You had security block me from my office? The board suspended. You pending investigation, I replied evenly. Access restrictions are standard procedure in such cases. This is insane. You've manipulated my father with lies about financial improprieties that you couldn't possibly understand. I understand more than you think, James, including the possibility of Bermuda accounts not authorized by the board. There was a telling silence before he responded, his tone suddenly dangerous rather than merely angry. You're making serious accusations based on nothing but speculation. Am I? The board didn't think so this morning when they reviewed the evidence of your unauthorized investments through Rockwell Partners. Imagine how they'll react to evidence of offshore accounts. You vindictive bitch, he hissed. You think you can step into my life, my position just like that? This isn't over, Eleanor, not by a long shot. Actually, it is over, James. Our marriage, your leadership of the foundation, both ended the moment you decided to introduce your mistress as my replacement. Everything since has merely been consequence. You have no idea what you're dealing with, he warned. Back off now, or you'll regret it. The naked threat in his voice confirmed Richard's warning about James's potential for desperation. Are you threatening me, James? Because that would be unwise, given your current legal vulnerability. I'm giving you one chance to walk away before this gets ugly. It already got ugly when you publicly humiliated me, I reminded him. Now, it's simply becoming truthful. Goodbye, James. I ended the call and sat for a moment, absorbing the implications of his reaction. The mention of Bermuda had clearly triggered his panic, confirming my suspicions that whatever he'd done there crossed legal lines he couldn't afford to have exposed. My office door opened, and Harrison entered with a concerned expression. Ms. Reynolds, Mr. James attempted to force his way past security. His father intervened and is escorting him from the building. Thank you, Harrison. Has this happened before? Mr. James has always had a forceful personality when challenged, Harrison replied diplomatically. I nodded, understanding the subtlety in his statement. Please arrange for increased security for the next few days and ensure all James's system access has been revoked. After Harrison left, I called Richard to update him on the confrontation with James. His reaction confirms our suspicions, Richard said gravely. But it also increases the risk. He knows you're investigating and feels cornered. What should I do? Document everything, back up any evidence you find in multiple secure locations, and Eleanor, be careful. Don't stay in that house alone. I glanced at my watch, nearly 6 o'clock. I'll go to Maya's tonight. Tomorrow, I'll look into temporary housing. Good, and keep me updated on anything you find. As I gathered my things to leave, William called. James is unstable, he said without preamble. I've never seen him this way. He threatened me, I told him. Rather explicitly. There was a long pause. I'm sending Harrison to escort you to a hotel tonight, not your home, the Bristol. A suite will be waiting under Williams, my middle name. I'll make arrangements for proper security starting tomorrow. I recognized that arguing would be pointless. William Aldridge Sr. was accustomed to managing crises his way. Thank you. Did James say anything revealing during your conversation? Nothing specific, but his panic is telling. William's voice hardened. If my son has engaged in criminal activity with foundation funds, there will be consequences, regardless of his surname. After hanging up, I sat for a moment in the gathering dusk of my new office. In less than 48 hours, my life had transformed completely, from discarded wife to foundation director, from social accessory to active investigator of potential financial crimes. James's threat echoed in my mind, along with Richard's warning about desperate people. If I pursued this investigation to its conclusion, I could be putting myself at genuine risk. Was uncovering the truth worth that risk? The answer came with surprising clarity. Yes. Not for revenge, but because 15 years of playing by Aldridge rules had cost me too much of myself. I wouldn't back down now, regardless of the consequences. Harrison appeared at my door. "Your car is ready, Ms. Reynolds." As we rode the elevator down, I made a mental list of what I would need for the next phase of my investigation. Full access to all Foundation banking records, cooperation from the finance team, and perhaps most crucially, a way to trace any connections between the Foundation and Bermuda banks. Little did I know that the answers were already making their way to me, carried by an unexpected messenger with motives of her own. Chapter 7. Dangerous Evidence. The Bristol Hotel suite arranged by William was luxurious but impersonal, much like my marriage had been. Harrison had insisted on checking the rooms before leaving me, his caution reinforcing the gravity of my situation. Now, alone in the unfamiliar space, I found myself suddenly exhausted by the day's events. I ordered room service and called Maya to update her. "James showed up at the office?" she asked, alarmed. "What did he do?" "Threatened me, though not physically. William intervened before he could make it past security." "This is getting serious. Ellie." Her voice carried uncharacteristic concern. "Maybe you should back off. Let the authorities handle the financial investigation." "I can't, not yet," I explained. "I need solid evidence before involving authorities. Without it, this becomes a family dispute rather than a potential criminal case. And the Aldridges would close ranks," Maya finished my thought. "Still, promise me you'll be careful. James has always struck me as someone who values appearances above all else. Now that you've threatened both his image and his freedom—" "I'll be careful," I promised. "Williams arranged security, and I'm being cautious about what I reveal, and to whom." After we hung up, I tried to focus on the room service dinner, but my appetite had vanished. Instead, I opened my laptop and began organizing what I knew about James's financial activities. It wasn't much. Circumstantial evidence of irregular transfers, Vanessa's mention of Bermuda, and James's suspicious reaction when confronted. Not enough to prove wrongdoing, let alone criminal intent. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Need to talk. Have information about Bermuda. Can we meet?" Vanessa. How had she gotten my number? More importantly, what information did she have? I hesitated before responding. Meeting with Vanessa privately could be risky, either a genuine attempt to help or a trap set by James. Eventually, caution won out. "Not in person. What information do you have?" Her response came quickly. "Documents. Jay left his briefcase at my apartment during chaos after dinner. Contains USB drive with offshore account details. Meeting safer than digital transfer." The message triggered both suspicion and interest. If she truly had a drive with offshore account information, it could be exactly the evidence I needed. But the insistence on meeting in person raised red flags. I called Richard for advice. "It's either genuine or an elaborate setup," he said, after I explained. "But if it's genuine, those documents could be crucial. So I should meet her?" "Yes, but not alone and not anywhere private. Very public place, daytime, with someone watching your back." I considered my options. The courtyard at the MFA, tomorrow at noon. Plenty of witnesses, security cameras, multiple exits. Good choice. I'll be nearby, keeping an eye on things. And, Eleanor, tell William about this. If James is involved, his father should know. After sending Vanessa the meeting details, I called William. "Vanessa claims to have documents regarding Bermuda accounts," I said without preamble. "I'm meeting her tomorrow to assess if they're genuine." William's response was characteristically direct. "I'll have someone follow her before the meeting. Make sure she's not meeting with James first. Harrison will drive you." "That's not necessary." "It's not negotiable," he cut me off. If my son has committed financial crimes using the Foundation's resources, I need to know. But I won't risk your safety to find out. His concern seemed genuine, though I wondered how much was for me personally versus the Foundation's interests. Still, the extra security was prudent given James's earlier threats. All right, Harrison can drive me, but he stays at a distance during the meeting. Agreed. Be careful, Eleanor. Family politics are one thing. Criminal activity is quite another. Sleep eluded me that night despite the luxurious surroundings. My mind cycled through possibilities. What if the documents were fabricated? What if Vanessa was working with James to neutralize me? What if the evidence was real and implicated James in serious financial crimes? By morning, I had decided on a careful approach. I would meet Vanessa as planned but maintain skepticism until I could verify any documents she provided. Harrison arrived precisely at 11:30 to drive me to the Museum of Fine Arts. During the ride, he briefed me on William's additional precautions. Mr. Aldridge has arranged for museum security to be aware of your meeting, ma'am. Miss Calloway has been under observation since early this morning. She left her apartment at 10:45 and went directly to a coffee shop, where she remains. Has she had contact with James? Not that we've observed. Mr. James spent the night at the Ritz and has not left the hotel today. This information was somewhat reassuring, though it also reinforced the surreal turn my life had taken, having my husband's movements monitored like a potential criminal. The museum courtyard was busy with the lunchtime crowd when I arrived, exactly as I'd hoped. I chose a seat near the central fountain with clear sightlines to all entrances. Harrison positioned himself discreetly by the cafe entrance, while Richard texted that he was watching from the Japanese garden area. Vanessa arrived precisely at noon, looking nervous but composed. She wore casual clothes, jeans and a light sweater, with her hair pulled back and minimal makeup, a sharp contrast to her usual polished appearance. She carried a small messenger bag clutched tightly against her body. She scanned the courtyard before spotting me, then approached cautiously. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, sitting across from me. "You said you have information," I responded, skipping pleasantries. She glanced around before leaning forward. "After I left your house yesterday, I went home to find James waiting in my apartment. He was angry, drunk, demanding to know what we'd talked about." "Did you tell him?" "Not everything." She looked down. I was scared. He was different, aggressive in a way I'd never seen before. "What happened?" "He got a call, from Martin Rockwell, I think. Something about securing the accounts and damage control. He left in a hurry, forgot his briefcase." She patted her messenger bag. "I found the USB drive in a hidden compartment." "And you decided to bring it to me rather than return it to James," I observed. "Why?" Vanessa met my gaze directly. "Because I looked at what was on it. Financial records, transfers to accounts in Bermuda. Millions of dollars moved from the Aldridge Foundation through shell companies. I may not understand all the financial details, but I know enough to recognize money laundering. That's a serious accusation. It's why I'm here." She reached into her bag and removed a sealed envelope. "I made copies of everything. The originals are in a secure location in case anything happens." I took the envelope, noting its weight. Likely containing the USB drive she'd mentioned. "You realize this could implicate James in criminal activity?" She nodded, her expression troubled. "I know. But after seeing those documents and experiencing his behavior yesterday, I'm afraid of him, Eleanor. And I don't want to be complicit in whatever he's doing." Her fear seemed genuine, adding credibility to her story. Still, caution was necessary. "What do you want in exchange for this?" I asked directly. "Protection," she replied without hesitation. "If these documents prove James committed crimes, he'll know I took them. I need assurance I won't face retaliation, professional or otherwise." It was a reasonable request. If these documents contain evidence of criminal activity, I'll ensure you're recognized as a whistleblower rather than an accomplice. Your cooperation will be noted. Relief flickered across her face. There's one more thing you should know. Some of the transfers were designated for art acquisitions through offshore dealers. The museum's name appears in several documents, though I don't know if anyone there was involved. This new information complicated matters. If the Gardner Museum was somehow connected to James's potentially illegal activities, it could trigger a much broader investigation. Thank you for bringing this to me, I said, tucking the envelope securely in my bag. I'll need time to review these documents and verify their authenticity. Of course. Vanessa stood to leave, then hesitated. Eleanor, I'm sorry. For everything. I didn't understand what I was walking into with James and his family. Few do, I replied simply. Be careful, Vanessa. Don't contact James, and consider staying somewhere other than your apartment for a few days. After she left, Richard joined me while Harrison maintained his surveillance position. Well? Richard asked, nodding toward my bag. She delivered what appears to be evidence of offshore accounts and possible money laundering, potentially involving the Gardner Museum. Richard's eyebrows shot up. That's more significant than we anticipated. We should get that drive to a secure location and make multiple copies immediately. My thoughts exactly. We arranged to meet at Richard's office, where he had secure servers for sensitive client information. Harrison, ever vigilant, insisted on escorting me directly there, despite my assurances that I could manage on my own. As we left the museum, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I scanned the surroundings but saw nothing suspicious. Still, the sensation persisted, a prickling awareness that the stakes had just risen dramatically and dangerous. Consequences might follow. Little did I know how right that instinct would prove to be. ARSA Chapter 8, The Confession. Richard's office at Harvard Business School offered the privacy and security we needed to examine the contents of Vanessa's USB drive. His administrative assistant cleared his afternoon schedule while his IT specialist prepared a secure workstation isolated from external networks. We'll create multiple copies and analyze the contents without risk of remote deletion or monitoring, Richard explained as his IT specialist, Raj, set up the system. You think that's a concern? I asked. With potentially incriminating financial documents? Absolutely. Sophisticated embezzlement schemes often include security measures to protect or destroy evidence if accessed improperly. Raj nodded in agreement. I've seen cases where files contained tracking code that reported back to the creator when opened, or even self-destructed after a certain number of views. With these precautions in mind, we proceeded carefully. Raj inserted the USB drive into an air-gapped computer, one with no internet connection, and began copying its contents to secure local storage. Interesting structure, he commented, as directories appeared on screen. Multiple layers of folders, some encrypted. Someone went to considerable effort to organize and protect this information. Can you access the encrypted files? Richard asked. Some, yes. They're using standard encryption that I can bypass. Others might take more time. Raj worked methodically, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he navigated through the digital maze. What emerged over the next hour confirmed our suspicions and worse. The unencrypted files contained records of wire transfers from Aldridge Foundation accounts to a series of shell companies, which then transferred funds to accounts at 3 different Bermuda banks. The amounts were significant, over $12 million in the past 18 months alone. This goes beyond mismanagement, Richard said grimly as we reviewed the documents. These transfers weren't authorized by the Foundation Board. Each one includes James's digital signature, but none of the counter-signatures required for transactions over $250,000. Could he claim these were authorized verbally? I asked. Richard shook his head. The Foundation bylaws explicitly require written authorization from at least 2 board members for international transfers. There's no ambiguity. As Raj continued decrypting files, more damning evidence emerged. One folder contained communications between James and Martin Rockwell discussing the private allocation of funds and references to our Bermuda arrangement. Another held spreadsheets tracking personal expenses paid from these offshore accounts, luxury purchases, property investments, and substantial cash withdrawals. This is textbook embezzlement, Richard concluded, using Foundation funds for personal benefit through offshore accounts to avoid detection. The most troubling discovery came in a recently modified folder labeled Contingency. It contained what appeared to be framework documents for transferring blame to others should the scheme be discovered. My name appeared prominently. He was planning to frame me, I realized, scanning the fabricated emails and backdated documents that portrayed me as the architect of the offshore accounts. These documents suggest I directed the transfers and kept James in the dark. Richard studied the files with growing concern. This is methodically planned. He created a paper trail that would implicate you if anyone investigated. The timestamps indicate he's been building this alternative narrative for months. Long before our marriage publicly fell apart, I noted, feeling a chill at the calculated betrayal. He was protecting himself while setting me up to take the fall if necessary. The good news, Raj interjected, is that digital forensics can prove these documents were created retroactively. The bad news is that without this drive, a surface-level investigation might have accepted his version of events. As the full scope of James's actions became clear, I felt a complex mix of emotions: anger at his willingness to destroy me to save himself, vindication that my suspicions were justified, and fear about what he might do when he discovered the evidence was in my possession. "What now?" I asked Richard, who had been taking detailed notes. "We need to move carefully," he advised. "This evidence should go to the proper authorities, but timing and approach matter. If James realizes we have this before we've secured legal protections for you and Vanessa, he could take desperate measures, including destroying additional evidence," I realized. There must be more documentation at the Foundation or in his personal files. Richard nodded. "Exactly. I suggest we brief William immediately. As Foundation chairman, he has both the authority and resources to secure any remaining evidence. Then we prepare a formal presentation for the board, followed by notification to regulatory authorities. And James? Should not be alerted until all evidence is secured and proper authorities are involved." Richard's expression was grave. "These documents suggest he's been systematically stealing from a charitable foundation for years. He's facing potential prison time, Eleanor. That makes him dangerous." We spent the next hour creating secure copies of all files and preparing a summary of findings for William. Richard called his most trusted former student, who now specialized in financial crimes at a prestigious law firm, arranging for her to join us for the meeting with William. As we worked, my phone rang. Catherine. "Eleanor, where are you?" Her voice carried unmistakable urgency. "At Harvard with Richard Chen." "Why? What's wrong?" "James is looking for you, frantically. He showed up at the Foundation offices demanding to know where you were, then came to your house. When he couldn't find you, he called me." My pulse quickened. "What did he say?" "He claimed you've taken something that belongs to him. Something important." Catherine hesitated. "Ellie, he sounded unhinged. Kept saying you don't understand what you're getting involved in, that people could get hurt." Richard, seeing my expression, moved closer to hear the conversation. "Did he make specific threats?" I asked Catherine. "Not exactly, but his tone. I've never heard him like this. It scared me enough to call and warn you." "Thank you. I'm safe, with people I trust. Don't tell James anything about contacting me." After hanging up, I relayed the conversation to Richard. "He knows," Richard concluded. "Either Vanessa told him or he discovered the drive was missing. Either way, your safety is now the priority. We need to accelerate our timeline. Within 15 minutes, Richard had arranged for a secure meeting with William at his private club in Back Bay. Harrison, who had remained discreetly outside Richard's office throughout our analysis, would escort us there directly. As we prepared to leave, Richard received a call from Raj, who had continued working on the encrypted files. "You need to see this before you go," Raj said, his voice unusually tense. "I've accessed a hidden directory with documentation of art transactions. Purchases through offshore dealers using foundation funds. But the art never went to the foundation collection." "Where did it go?" Richard asked. "According to these records, into private collections under shell company ownership. But here's the concerning part. The most recent transactions involve the Gardner Museum. Several valuable pieces were purchased using foundation money, donated to the museum for tax benefits, then mysteriously deaccessioned through a private dealer who appears to be connected to Rockwell Partners. This added a new dimension to the scandal, one that potentially implicated not just James, but others at the museum." "Is there any indication of Vanessa's involvement?" I asked. Raj shook his head. "Her name doesn't appear in any of these files. The museum contact is listed as Director of Special Acquisitions, someone named Philip Harrington." I recognized the name immediately. Philip is the museum's deputy director. He's been there for decades, long before Vanessa joined. This information complicated our situation further. If senior museum leadership was involved in James's scheme, it could explain why he'd been so eager to cultivate a relationship with Vanessa, not just for personal reasons, but to strengthen his connection to the institution. With this new information in hand, we departed for the meeting with William. Harrison drove with heightened vigilance, taking an indirect route and checking frequently for signs of pursuit. "Mr. Aldridge Sr. is concerned about your safety," he explained when I questioned a particularly circuitous turn. "He's received information that Mr. James is behaving erratically." "What kind of information?" I pressed. Harrison hesitated, then answered with careful precision. "Mr. James attempted to access the family's private safe deposit box at Boston Trust this morning. When informed that his access had been temporarily suspended by his father, he became demonstrative. Security was required to escort him from the premises." This was alarming news. The Aldridge family's safe deposit box, from what James had mentioned over the years, contained valuable documents and family heirlooms, including emergency funds and identity documents that could facilitate quick departure from the country. "He's planning to run," I realized aloud. Harrison's silence was confirmation enough. William was already waiting when we arrived at the Algonquin Club, seated in a private dining room with the composed demeanor that belied the family crisis unfolding. Only the slight tightening around his eyes suggested the strain he was under. "Eleanor, Richard," he nodded to each of us as we took seats at the table. "I understand you have information regarding James's financial activities." For the next 45 minutes, Richard methodically presented our findings, supported by key documents from the USB drive. William listened without interruption, his expression growing progressively grimmer as the evidence mounted. $12 million, he said finally, the first words he'd spoken since our presentation began. Diverted from charitable purposes to personal accounts, and a plan to frame Eleanor if discovered. "Yes," Richard confirmed, "the evidence is conclusive." William turned to me, his gaze penetrating. "And you had no knowledge of these activities during your marriage?" "None," I replied firmly. Though in retrospect, there were signs I should have questioned more deeply. His increasing secretiveness about foundation matters, unexplained trips to Bermuda, sudden changes in our personal spending patterns? William nodded slowly. "The foundation's reputation, the family's reputation, will suffer tremendously when this becomes public." "It doesn't have to become public," I said carefully. Both men looked at me with surprise. "The priority should be recovering the misappropriated," funds, and ensuring proper governance going forward, I continued. If James cooperates fully, returns the money, and resigns from all foundation positions, perhaps a public scandal could be avoided. William's eyes narrowed. You're suggesting we handle this privately? After what he's done, including attempting to frame you? I'm suggesting we consider all options before proceeding. The Foundation's work is too important to be derailed by scandal if there's an alternative path. Richard looked skeptical. Eleanor, the evidence suggests criminal activity. There are legal obligations to report such findings. I understand that, I acknowledged. But as chairman, William has some discretion in how and when to proceed. Perhaps there's a middle path that serves justice without destroying the Foundation's ability to continue its charitable work. William studied me with new interest. You continue to surprise me, Eleanor. Most people in your position would demand maximum consequences. I'm not interested in revenge, I replied honestly. I want accountability, protection for those James tried to harm, and preservation of the Foundation's positive work. How we achieve those goals matters less to me than ensuring they are achieved. Before William could respond, his phone buzzed. He checked the message, his expression darkening. James has been located. He's at the Gardner Museum, demanding to speak with Philip Harrington. The implications were immediately clear. James was attempting to warn his co-conspirator, or perhaps destroy evidence of their joint activities. We need to move quickly, Richard urged, if they coordinate their stories or dispose of evidence. William was already on his feet. I've instructed security to detain James if he attempts to leave. Eleanor, I'd prefer you remain here where it's safe. No, I said firmly, standing as well. I need to be present. This involves me directly, both as his target and as the Foundation's current director. William appeared ready to argue, but seemed to recognize the determination in my stance. Very well. Harrison will ensure your safety at all times. The drive to the Gardner Museum was tense and silent. William made several calls, mobilizing what seemed to be a private security team to secure entrances and prevent James's departure. Richard conversed quietly with his former student, now identified as Andrea Morris, a specialist in financial crimes, discussing legal strategies. I sat wrapped in my thoughts, trying to reconcile the James I had married with the man who had not only betrayed our vows, but had methodically planned to destroy me to save himself. Had I ever truly known him? Or had I merely known the carefully constructed persona he presented to the world? And to me? The museum was closing for the day when we arrived, visitors streaming out through the majestic entrance. William's security team, discreet but unmistakably professional, had already established positions at all exits. James and Harrington are in Harrington's office on the administrative level, the security lead informed William as we entered. They've been there for approximately 20 minutes. No one has entered or left. William nodded. Any indication of their activities? Nothing visible from our position, sir. The office has privacy blinds which are currently closed. William turned to our group. I'll confront James directly. Eleanor, you should remain. I'm coming with you, I interrupted firmly. I deserve to hear whatever explanation he offers. After a moment's consideration, William nodded. Richard, Andrea, your legal expertise may be needed. Harrison, stay close to Eleanor at all times. Our small procession moved through the museum's elegant corridors to the administrative wing. Unlike the opulent public spaces designed to showcase the Gardner's remarkable collection, these areas were modern and utilitarian, all efficiency rather than aesthetics. Harrington's office was located at the end of a long hallway, its frosted glass door bearing his name and title. William paused before it, straightened his already impeccable posture, and knocked with the authority of a man unused to being denied entry anywhere. The door opened to reveal Philip Harrington, a thin, aristocratic man in his 60s with perfectly coiffed silver hair and the perpetually pained expression of someone who finds most of humanity slightly disappointing. His composure faltered, visibly at the sight of our group. "William," he managed, his voice betraying unexpected nervousness. "This is unexpected." "I'm here to see my son," William replied, already moving past Harrington into the office. James stood by the window, his back to the door. He turned as we entered, his expression cycling rapidly from surprise to alarm to a forced calm that didn't reach his eyes. "Father," he acknowledged, then spotted me. "And Eleanor. What an interesting delegation you've assembled." "We need to talk, James," William said, his tone leaving no room for evasion. "About Bermuda accounts, diverted foundation funds, and your plan to frame your wife for your crimes." James blanched but recovered quickly. "I don't know what Eleanor has told you, but she's told me nothing I haven't verified independently." William cut him off. "We have the USB drive, James. All of it. The transfers, the shell companies, the fraudulent documentation attempting to implicate Eleanor, and your arrangements with the museum." At this, Harrington made a small, distressed sound. "I should perhaps excuse myself." "Stay exactly where you are, Philip," William commanded without looking at him. "Your role in this matter will be addressed momentarily." James's composure cracked further. "Whatever you think you know is incomplete. There are explanations." $12 million, James," I interjected quietly. "Transferred without board approval to offshore accounts for your personal use. What possible explanation could justify that?" His gaze, when it met mine, contained something I'd never seen before, not just anger or fear, but a profound emptiness that sent a chill through me. "You wouldn't understand," he said finally. "None of you would. The pressures, the expectations, always having to be the perfect Aldridge heir." William's expression hardened. "Don't attempt to blame the family name for your criminal behavior." "Criminal?" James laughed bitterly. "You built this family fortune on what would be considered criminal by today's standards, Father. Grandfather's real estate dealings in the 60s? The hostile takeovers in the 70s? I simply updated the family tradition for the modern era." "The foundation is a charitable organization," Richard pointed out, speaking for the first time. "Its assets are held in trust for public benefit, not family enrichment." James dismissed this with a wave. "Semantics. The foundation has always been a vehicle for Aldridge influence and tax advantages. I simply recognized its potential for more direct benefits and decided to steal from it," I said, unable to keep the disgust from my voice. "I prefer to think of it as compensation for years of unrecognized service," James replied. "Do you have any idea what it's like to be an Aldridge, Eleanor? The constant pressure to expand the family empire while maintaining the public facade of selfless philanthropy? I earned that money." "And the plan to frame Eleanor if you were caught?" William asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Was that also justified in your mind?" For the first time, James had the grace to look uncomfortable. "That was a contingency I never intended to implement. Just insurance. Insurance that would have destroyed my reputation and possibly sent me to prison in your place," I noted. "How convenient." Philip Harrington, who had been growing increasingly agitated during this exchange, suddenly spoke up. "James assured me the financial arrangements were completely legitimate. Board approved. I had no reason to question." "Save your denials for the authorities, Philip," William interrupted coldly. "The documentation indicates you received substantial, personal benefits for facilitating certain art transactions. Your complicity will be addressed appropriately." Harrington seemed to physically shrink under William's gaze, retreating to a chair in the corner of the office. James, however, appeared to be regaining his composure, his mind visibly working to find an escape route from his situation. "What happens now? A public scandal would damage the foundation irrevocably. Is that what you want, Father? To see your life's work destroyed over what amounts to a family disagreement about resource allocation?" A family disagreement? William's voice vibrated with contained fury. You stole millions from a charitable foundation, conspired to commit fraud, and attempted to frame an innocent person for your crimes. This is not a disagreement, James. It's a betrayal of everything the Aldridge name should represent. Yet, you're here rather than with the FBI, James observed shrewdly, which suggests you're open to a more private resolution. I watched the calculation return to James's expression, the familiar confidence of a man accustomed to negotiating, his way out of difficult situations. William's response was measured. I'm here because you're my son, and I wanted to give you the opportunity to confess and make restitution voluntarily before more severe consequences become inevitable. Restitution is possible, James conceded. Most of the funds remain in accessible accounts. With proper financial structuring, they could be returned to the foundation without triggering regulatory scrutiny. And the attempt to frame Eleanor? William pressed. James glanced at me, something like genuine regret flickering briefly across his face. A contingency plan I'm not proud of. Obviously, all such documentation would be destroyed as part of any agreement. This isn't just about money, James, I said quietly. You betrayed everything. Our marriage, your family's trust, the Foundation's mission. How can any of that be repaired with a financial transaction? For a moment, James's mask slipped completely, revealing a glimpse of the lost and desperate man beneath the polished exterior. It can't, he admitted, the words seeming to cost him physical pain. I know that now, but perhaps some damage can be limited, for the family's sake, if not for mine. William studied his son with an expression of profound disappointment. You'll make full restitution. You'll resign from all family businesses and foundation positions. You'll provide complete documentation of every unauthorized transaction and cooperate fully with internal investigations. And in return? James asked cautiously. In return, I will consider allowing you to avoid public prosecution, provided all funds are recovered and no further evidence of criminal activity emerges. William's tone made clear this was his final offer. I watched James carefully during this exchange, noting the slight relaxation of his shoulders as he realized prison might not be inevitable. Yet something in his expression remained guarded, suggesting he might not be revealing everything. There's more, isn't there? I asked suddenly. Something you haven't disclosed about these transactions. James looked startled, then resigned. Always perceptive, Eleanor. Yes, there's a complexity I haven't mentioned. Some of the funds were used for investments that cannot be easily liquidated, property developments in certain Caribbean jurisdictions, with restrictive partnership agreements. Meaning what exactly? Richard asked sharply. Meaning some of my investment partners might object strenuously to sudden withdrawal, James replied carefully. These aren't individuals accustomed to having their financial plans disrupted. William's expression darkened with understanding. You've entangled foundation money with criminal organizations. James winced at the blunt assessment. I'd characterize them as business entities operating in regulatory environments different from our own. Money launderers and tax evaders, Andrea Morris clarified, speaking for the first time. Potentially worse, depending on the jurisdictions involved. The implications were staggering. If James had tied foundation funds to criminal enterprises, recovering the money would be not just difficult, but potentially dangerous. This changes the calculations significantly, William said, his voice hardening. Criminal exposure for the foundation could extend well beyond financial mismanagement. Which is precisely why a private resolution remains the best approach, James argued. I can manage the extraction of funds gradually, maintaining the necessary relationships while minimizing risk. I watched this negotiation with growing unease, realizing that James, despite his apparent contrition, was maneuvering toward a position where he would remain essential to resolving the very crisis he had created. His expertise in navigating the criminal enterprises he'd engaged with would become his leverage for avoiding the worst consequences. "No," I said firmly, drawing surprised looks from everyone in the room. "There will be no private resolution. That leaves James in control of any aspect of this situation. The proper authorities need to be involved precisely because criminal organizations are implicated." James stared at me with a mixture of disbelief and anger. "You can't be serious. Involving authorities puts everyone at risk. The foundation, the family name, possibly even individual safety. The risk was created by your actions, James, not by the proper response to them," I replied steadily. "I won't be party to a cover-up that potentially perpetuates harm." William studied me thoughtfully before turning back to his son. "Eleanor is right. This has moved beyond a family matter. The involvement of criminal elements changes everything." "You're making a catastrophic mistake," James warned, desperation edging into his voice. "Some of these people, you have no idea what they're capable of if their interests are threatened. Then you should have considered that before involving a charitable foundation in their activities," William responded coldly. "Harrison, please escort my son to my home and ensure he remains there until proper authorities can be briefed." As Harrison moved toward James, the atmosphere in the room shifted palpably. James straightened, a dangerous calm replacing his previous agitation. "I'm afraid that won't be possible," he said quietly. "I've already made alternative arrangements." In the moment of confusion that followed, everything happened with disorienting speed. James lunged toward his jacket hanging near the door, extracting something that glinted metallically in the office lights. Harrison moved with surprising agility, for his age, positioning himself between James and the rest of us. "James, don't be foolish," William warned, his voice steady despite the sudden escalation. "Foolish?" James laughed bitterly, brandishing what I now recognized as a small handgun. "I crossed that line long ago, Father. Now I'm simply being practical." Harrison spoke calmly, his hands slightly raised. "Mr. James, please put down the weapon. This situation can still be resolved without additional consequences." For a terrifying moment, I thought James might actually fire the gun. His hand trembled slightly, his eyes wild with a cornered desperation I'd never witnessed in him before. Then, abruptly, he seemed to reach a decision. "Tell them what they want to know, Philip," he said to Harrington without looking away from us. "I'm sorry to leave you holding the proverbial bag, but survival occasionally requires sacrifice." Before anyone could react, James swung suddenly toward the office's secondary door, one I hadn't noticed before, partially hidden behind a filing cabinet. He yanked it open and disappeared through it. Harrison moved immediately in pursuit, followed by William's security team who had been positioned in the hallway. Richard pulled me protectively away from the door while William went to Harrington, who sat ashen-faced and trembling. "Where does that door lead?" William demanded. "See service corridor," Harrington stammered. "Connects to the loading dock on the east side of the building." William immediately relayed this information via phone to his security team, but a sinking feeling told me James had planned this escape route carefully. The loading dock would provide easy access to the street, where he likely had transportation, waiting. Sure enough, Harrison returned minutes later, his expression confirming my fears. He had a car waiting, left before we could secure the area. William's face hardened into a mask of determination. "Alert all security personnel. Contact our connections at the State Police and Border Patrol. I want all airports, train stations, and port authorities notified immediately." As William issued these commands, I found myself staring at the door through which James had disappeared. AI, metaphorical and literal exit from the life we had shared. My husband introduced his mistress as my replacement. At family dinner, what happened next? No one expected. Chapter 1: The Invitation. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, a crisp white envelope adorned with my mother-in-law's elegant handwriting. Margaret Aldridge never used email for important family matters, considering digital communications lacking the personal touch. The card inside announced the annual Aldridge Family Dinner, a tradition spanning 4 decades that brought together the sprawling family tree of one of Boston's oldest families. I traced my finger over the embossed lettering, feeling the familiar weight of expectation that came with these gatherings. 15 years of marriage to James Aldridge had taught me the unspoken rules of his family. Appearance was everything. Emotions were to be contained, and family legacy trumped personal happiness. "Eleanor?" James's voice echoed from the foyer of our Beacon Hill brownstone. "Are you home?" I slipped the invitation into the drawer of my writing desk and called back. "In the study." My husband appeared in the doorway, his 6-foot frame, filling the space with the confident posture of a man accustomed to commanding rooms. At 45, James still maintained the athletic build of his college rowing days, his dark hair now threaded with distinguished silver at the temples. He loosened his tie, Hermes, a Christmas gift from me, and smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "Mother called," he said, crossing the room to pour himself a whiskey from the crystal decanter. "She's particularly excited about the dinner this year." I nodded, watching him. "The invitation just arrived." "Good, good." He swirled the amber liquid, not meeting my gaze. "There's something I've been meaning to discuss with you about the dinner." A knot formed in my stomach, the instinctive tightening I'd come to recognize as my body's warning system. Over the past 6 months, these moments had become more frequent. James working late, mysterious phone calls that ended when I entered the room, weekend business trips that left no paper trail. What about it? I kept my voice steady, a skill perfected through years of navigating Aldridge family politics. James drained his glass and set it down with deliberate care. "I think it's time for some changes, Eleanor. For both of us." The afternoon light caught the crystal tumbler, casting prism patterns across the antique Persian rug, a wedding gift from James's parents. I focused on those dancing lights as James spoke words that, despite my suspicions, still landed like physical blows. "I've met someone. Her name is Vanessa. She's young, vibrant. She understands the direction I want to take in life." He spoke as if discussing a business merger rather than the dissolution of our marriage. "I want to bring her to the family dinner. I think it's time everyone meets the woman who will be taking your place." The silence that followed seemed to have physical weight. I stared at him. This man I'd shared a bed with for 15 years, whose family history I could recite better than my own, whose coffee preferences I knew by heart. The stranger standing before me, proposing to parade his mistress in front of, his entire family in front of me. "You can't be serious." My voice sounded far away, as if belonging to someone else. "I'm entirely serious, Eleanor." His tone took on the edge he typically reserved for difficult clients at his law firm. "I've given this considerable thought. The dinner is the perfect opportunity. Everyone will be there. We can make the announcement once and then proceed with the necessary arrangements." "Necessary arrangements," I repeated, the euphemism for divorce hanging between us. "Yes, I've already spoken with Philip about the legal aspects." Philip Bennett, James's college roommate and our family attorney. The betrayal deepened. How many people knew before me? "And what do you expect me to do? Sit there while you introduce this woman to your family? Pass her the gravy and offer congratulations?" James sighed, a sound of impatience rather than remorse. "I expected you to handle this with the grace you've always shown, Eleanor. It would be easier for everyone." "Easier." The word tasted bitter. "For whom exactly?" "For the family. For us. For Vanessa." He straightened his cuffs, another habit when he felt challenged. "I'm not asking for your blessing, Eleanor. I'm informing you of my decision." In that moment, something shifted inside me, a tectonic movement in the landscape of my identity. For 15 years, I'd been Eleanor Aldridge, devoted wife, perfect, hostess, gracious daughter-in-law. I'd sublimated my own ambitions as a writer to support James's career, postponed having children at his request, and navigated the treacherous waters of Boston high society without complaint. But as I looked at the stranger wearing my husband's face, I realized the role I'd perfected had just been eliminated, without so much as a courtesy notice. "Get out," I said quietly. "Eleanor, get out of my study. We'll discuss the logistics later." He hesitated, seemingly surprised by my calm tone. Then, with a curt nod, he left. I sat motionless until his footsteps faded, then pulled out my phone and dialed the one person who had known me before I became an Aldridge. "Hey, stranger," answered Maya Russo, my best friend since freshman year at Wellesley. "To what do I owe this midweek call?" "My husband just informed me he's bringing his mistress to the Aldridge family dinner to introduce her as my replacement." The sharp intake of breath was followed by a string of Italian expletives that would have made Maya's Sicilian grandmother blush. "I'll be there in 30 minutes with emergency supplies," she said once she'd exhausted her vocabulary of curses. "No need," I replied, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. "I'm not falling apart." "Eleanor?" "Actually," I interrupted, an idea taking shape, "I think I'll attend this dinner after all." "You can't be serious. Tell James to go to hell." "Oh, I plan to." I glanced at my reflection in the antique mirror across the room, noting the steel in my eyes that hadn't been there minutes before. But not just yet. I believe I owe the Aldridge family one last appearance. After ending the call with the concerned Maya, I sat at my writing desk and pulled out a sheet of my personal stationery. For 15 years, I'd played by the Aldridge. Perhaps it was time to write some of my own. Chapter 2. The Other Woman. The week following James's announcement passed in a strange limbo. We moved around each other like cautious dancers, maintaining the facade of normalcy while sleeping in separate bedrooms. James spent most evenings out, returning late with the faint scent of unfamiliar perfume clinging to his clothes. I used the time to plan. First, I contacted my long-neglected literary agent, Diane, who was delighted to hear from me after what she called my extended hibernation. Next, I made an appointment with Carol Fisher, an attorney friend from my charity, committee work who specialized in high-profile divorces. Then, I began the meticulous work of documenting our finances, making copies of tax returns, investment accounts, and property deeds. By Friday, I was ready for reconnaissance. "You want me to what?" Maya's voice carried through my phone speaker as I sorted through my closet. "I need you to help me get information on Vanessa. James mentioned she works at the Gardner Museum in Development. That's all I know." "And how exactly am I supposed to extract this information? Break in and steal her personnel file?" I smiled despite myself. "Nothing so dramatic. You're on the museum's board. Surely you can find out something useful." Maya sighed, the sound of capitulation. "Fine, but I still think you should skip this dinner and let James explain to his snooty family why his wife isn't there." "Trust me," I replied, selecting a black dress I'd never worn, a impulse purchase that James had deemed too daring for an Aldridge wife. "I need to be there for what I have planned." By Saturday afternoon, Maya had delivered as promised. Vanessa Calloway, 29, had joined the museum's development team 8 months ago after completing her master's in arts administration at NYU. She was reportedly brilliant at cultivating donors, with a special talent for charming the older, male patrons. "She's also sickeningly gorgeous," Maya added during our coffee meeting at a discreet cafe far from Beacon Hill, "like a young Audrey Hepburn with better hair." "Of course she is," I murmured, stirring my cappuccino. "I managed to see a photo from a recent donor event. Want to see?" I hesitated, then nodded. Maya slid her phone across the table. The woman in the photo was indeed beautiful, with delicate features, luminous skin, and dark hair styled in an elegant bob. She was laughing at something said by the elderly man beside her hand resting lightly on his arm in a gesture of practiced intimacy. "That's Reginald Pierce," I noted, recognizing the museum's biggest donor. "She's good." "The best," Maya confirmed, reclaiming her phone. "Word is, she's increased major gifts by 30% since joining." I absorbed this information, adding it to my mental file. "Anything else?" Maya leaned forward, lowering her voice. "She's ambitious, Ellie. Very ambitious. There's talk she was hired specifically because of her connection to the Aldridge Foundation. The Aldridge Foundation was established by James's grandfather, a significant philanthropic force in Boston's cultural landscape, and a major supporter of the Gardner Museum. You think she targeted James?" The possibility hadn't occurred to me. Maya shrugged. "Or he targeted her. Either way, it's convenient timing with him taking over as foundation chair next year." This new angle required consideration. If Vanessa had orchestrated this relationship for professional advancement, it added another dimension to my evolving plan. "Thank you for this," I said, squeezing Maya's hand. "What are you going to do?" I smiled. "I'm going to introduce myself to Ms. Calloway. After all, we'll be family dinner companions very soon." Monday morning found me at the Gardner Museum during its quietest hours. I'd dressed carefully in a conservative Chanel suit, the uniform of the wealthy donor class that Vanessa would be trained to recognize and respect. The information desk directed me to the development office, where I requested a meeting with Ms. Calloway regarding a potential gift in memory of my recently deceased aunt, entirely fictional. 20 minutes later, I was seated across from the woman who was sleeping with my husband. In person, Vanessa Calloway was even more striking than in her photograph. She wore a simple navy dress that conveyed professionalism while highlighting her slender figure. Her office was meticulously organized, adorned with a single orchid and strategically placed art history books. "Mrs. Aldridge," she said, her composure slipping only momentarily when I provided my name. "What a pleasure to meet you. I wasn't aware you had an appointment today." "I appreciate you making time for me on short notice," I replied, studying her reaction. "I've been meaning to become more involved with the museum. James speaks so highly of the work you're doing here." A flush crept up her neck at the mention of my husband's name. "Mr. Aldridge has been very supportive of our initiatives." "I'm sure he has," I said, smiling pleasantly. "He's always been generous with his support." Her eyes flickered with uncertainty, clearly trying to determine how much I knew. I maintained my cordial expression, enjoying her discomfort, despite the anger simmering beneath my composed exterior. "You mentioned a potential memorial gift?" she prompted, attempting to steer the conversation to professional territory. "Yes, though I'm now considering directing it to the symphony instead." I leaned forward slightly. "I'm making several changes in my life recently. Reassessing priorities, you might say." Vanessa shifted in her chair, her discomfort now evident. "Mrs. Aldridge, Eleanor, please. We should be on a first-name basis, don't you think? Given the circumstances." The color drained from her face. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Come now, Vanessa," I said, keeping my tone light. "Let's not pretend. James has already informed me of his intention to bring you to the Aldridge family dinner this weekend as his replacement for me." Her eyes widened, genuine shock registering. "He told you that?" Interesting. She hadn't known about his blunt approach. "Yes, quite directly. James has never been one for subtlety in business or personal matters." I maintained my calm demeanor. "I thought we should meet privately first, woman to woman." Vanessa straightened, seemingly gathering her composure. "I'm sorry you found out this way. It wasn't what either of us wanted." "And what did you want, Vanessa? A discreet affair with a wealthy married man? Or something more strategic, given your professional ambitions and the Aldridge Foundation's influence in this city?" Her expression hardened. "My relationship with James has nothing to do with my work." Everything in Boston has to do with everything else, as you'll discover if you last in this world. I stood up, smoothing my skirt. One question before I go. Did he promise you children? The question caught her off guard. That's a very personal matter. It is, I agreed. But you see, James promised me children too, then spent 15 years finding reasons to postpone. First his career, then market instability, then his father's illness. There was always a perfect, reasonable excuse. Uncertainty flickered. Across her face, the first crack in her polished veneer. I'm not here to warn you off or create a scene, Vanessa. I simply wanted to see you for myself. I collected my purse. I look forward to seeing you at dinner on Saturday. I believe you'll find the Aldridge family illuminating. As I turned to leave, she called after me. Eleanor? I paused at the door. I never meant to hurt anyone. It just happened. I looked back at this young woman who believed she was different, special, the exception to rules that had constrained generations of Boston marriages. Nothing just happens in the Aldridge world, Vanessa. Everything is by design. I offered a final smile. The question is, whose design are you really part of? I left her looking troubled, which was precisely my intention. Seeds of doubt carefully planted would grow on their own. Back in my car, I allowed myself a moment to process the encounter. Meeting Vanessa had clarified something important. She wasn't a villain in this story any more than I was. We were both women navigating a system designed by and for men like James, men who viewed relationships as assets to be managed and upgraded when convenient. The difference was that after 15 years, I finally understood the game.